You're listening to the American edition of The Voice of Russia. I'm Ellie Mui in Washington. The United Nations warns that the 21-month conflict in Syria is becoming increasingly sectarian as the ethnic and religious violence has erupted in the country. The UN panel, led by Brazilian Paulo Pinheiro, believes that the possibility of political confrontation between both pro-government forces and rebel groups has brought on an, quote, overtly sectarian problem to the front line with entire communities asked to either leave or be killed inside the country. Here to speak about the ethnic and religious strife from within Syria is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He is the executive director of the Center for Global Governance and Policy at Jindal School of International Affairs. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure to be on Voice of Russia.
So could you first give us an understanding of the major religious and ethnic groups who are contesting power within the country?
Well, as you know, this conflict began on a sectarian dimension. So I'm a little surprised the UN has issued this report rather late, because it was always being played on sectarian lines. The central one being, the one between the Alawites, who are the ruling class in Syria, and the Sunni majority population. This was always one of the main fault lines for this whole uprising, as well as the war that has brought in regional players. So it's fine for the United Nations to say now that it has become more and more sectarian, but the point I'm trying to say is that right from the start, from the word go, it's now almost 1.5 years ago, since the uprising began and since major parties positioned themselves to support various local actors, it was clear that this was meant to be a Shia-Sunni conflict. And what we have seen is that has intensified. There are, of course, smaller groups. You have, the Palestinians and the Kurds, both of whom are Sunnis, but they have unique identities in Syria because they're persecuted minorities who had received the generosity and the hosting of the Assad regime for a long time, but now even their loyalties are split. And the whole region, from Iraq to Lebanon, we are seeing, and beyond, we are seeing the Shia-Sunni as well as some of the other sectarian identities come out. So the question really for us to ponder is, why was this sectarian war instigated and fanned by outside powers for so long, and why is it taking us until now to accept that this was always a sectarian war and hardly a war for liberation or for democracy?
Well, speaking about outside factors, there are fighters being pulled from all across the Middle East and North Africa, many of them linked to extremist groups. You have Hezbollah supporting Assad's regime. So what could the aftermath of Assad stepping down or leaving his regime be like if he's no longer in power?
Well, the civil war is on right now. Civil war exacerbated by proxy form of abatement from outside. And even if the regime falls, which possibly is very much in the realms of possibility, you will see the intensification of the civil war instead of order and some kind of restoration of normalcy. Because even though the regime is toppled, we will need to create a kind of intersectarian coalition along the lines of what you have in Lebanon, so that the minorities are not completely obliterated in a kind of a reverse injustice by the new dispensation, which could be obviously dominated by Sunni community. So what we are going to see, I think, is this war in many ways is an extension of the so-called civil war in Iraq that happened 2006-2007, when for the first time the Shia-Sunni conflict became so huge and so unmanageable and so bloody that it set back the American plans and completely destroyed the fabric of harmony within the various groups of Islam. So I think now Syria is in many ways an advanced form of what we saw in Iraq, when there were gangs of both Shia and Sunni persuasions that were also armed both by the coalition authorities in some ways and also by neighboring powers and Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah and others. So this is the spillover effect that we are seeing now of the sectarian divide that was initially created during the American occupation of Iraq and which has now spread, because you see many of these armed actors that you mentioned have to do with what happened inside Iraq, as well as, of course, the larger battle for supremacy between the Iranian-led Shiite bloc and the Sunni powers like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which are arming the other side. So it's pretty bad, and it should have been avoided in the first place. And I'm afraid that there's too much blood that's already been spilled, and there's more coming, even if the regime falls, because like we see in Libya now, there's going to be disorder and complete chaos and mayhem. And all of this, I would blame Qatar and Saudi Arabia and how they began this whole game of arming the extremists to the point that now they have accepted that most of the Western aid, as well as the aid that is being channeled by the Sunni Arab states, is going into extremist hands. And by extremists, they mean Sunni jihadi elements. So if Sunni jihadis are getting most of the weapons from the Western allies, and if Shia extremists are getting most of the weaponry from Iran, then you have, the recipe for complete, for civil war multiplied several fold.
Well, the UN interviewed more than 1,200 victims and refugees in the past year, and they reported evidence of electric shock applied to genitals, torture, and so forth and so on. Could this also lead to finding criminals of war?
Absolutely. I think this war has been too brutal to even, contemplate in our kind of safe settings from where we are speaking. This war has been so nasty, and I think it's only after everything settles down, hopefully sometime in the distant future, when we can really, reckon with the devastation as well as the abuses that have been committed by many sides. And here, of course, the regime has its own share to blame, but so have the opposition groups. And some of these, executions that they have been displaying on YouTube and so on are so disturbing, because it just shows that the chances for coexistence have been completely obliterated through this kind of showcase brutality and violence. And again, it's shocking to me that states which are supposedly moderate and liberal, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, in the Western parlance, are fanning these extremist elements. For Hezbollah to say that we are going and performing jihad in Syria is understandable, because they have a direct interest in also preventing the fall of the Assad regime. So if both the Sunni and Shia extremists are performing jihad, then the point is that the ones who are getting crushed are the people of Syria and the civilians who are like grass being trampled by these two extremist sides.
Is there something that the international community could do to aid peace within the country, though?
Absolutely. Right from the start, I've been saying this for over a year and a half since this war has been on, that there should have been an agreement that there would be no external financing and support for any group whatsoever, and that the Syrians should have decided their own fate. That would have been the obvious solution, which would have prevented so much of this horrific losses of the last 1.5 years. The only thing that they can do now is to immediately, insist that all the puppeteers who are sending in forces, sending in weapons, withdraw right away and create a kind of an environment in which some dialogue or some negotiated exit for the Assad regime can happen. Because if there's no negotiated exit, as the Russian foreign minister said, we are going to reach a position where there's going to be so much more loss before some kind of change happens. We can avoid these losses. And the only way we can do that is by calling upon the principals, especially Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and their Western allies, who have been, instigating this right and stirring the pot from day one, to step back and act responsibly. What we have not seen in the last 1.5 years is any semblance of responsibility on the part of so-called promoters of freedom and democracy and moderate Islam. The ones who have been saying that they promote moderate Islam, unfortunately, have been the ones who have facilitated the rise of Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and Al-Qaeda in the whole region. And now, we are reaping the whirlwind, because it's become another Afghanistan in many ways, with the entire region drawn in and with sectarian alliances and counter-alliances being formed, and with plenty of weaponry and ammunition from outside. So what is this? Is this a liberation struggle? I've never accepted Syria as a liberation struggle in the mode in which it has been conducted, with so much violence and our external support. This is just, realpolitik at its worst, and secondly, divide and rule between different sects of Islam at its worst.
Could the conflict in Syria create an even larger problem with ethnic and religious strife in the future? Here to speak about the problems is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He is the Executive Director for the Center of Global Governance and Policy at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.